Hey guys, my name is Mo, I produce metal, and today I'm very excited to bring you the full tutorial for this drum sound. My overall philosophy when doing programmed MIDI drums is that I want it to be super simple. I only want one instance of Contact. As you can see here, I have several drum libraries in one instance, which I will go over very soon. This allows me to have only one MIDI file, which triggers all of the different libraries that I want at once. I'm also working with a lot of different channels so that I can automate different layers up and down. Say that I want less drum room, for instance, then I can just pull it down here. So it allows me to get a more or less dry sound super easy. Maybe we should start by going over which drum libraries I use. So first off, I am using P5 from GGD for all of the cymbals and for the snare. I'm feeding all of the cymbal tracks to one output, which I am processing individually later. For the snare, I am using the high-pitched snare, especially for Deathcore, which has a lot of fast parts like this. A higher-pitched snare will give a lot more definition and cut through a lot more. It also has the benefit of giving ghost notes great definition, as in this section. So it's the snare high here, and I am using actually full turbo mode because I really love this process sound, and you will see this as a pattern across my drum processing that I'm using a lot of pre-processed sounds, which I'm then blending in a way which I like and processing them a little bit extra, but this gives me a great starting point. Next, I am using the kick and the snare from Odeholm drums. So this one I'm using the high pitch snare. You can hear not as loud as the P5, but I really love the body of this snare. So I'm blending this in. Then we have the kick. Really meaty sounding kick. And I really love this for layering. Once again, I'm using the process tone here and I'm then blending it in. Next is a layer which has some damage hits. So if I solo it, you can hear it. This is a layer which I can then increase for breakdown sections. So you can see here it's quite low in the mix, but here for the breakdown at the end I am bumping it up. Next up, for One Kit Wonder Metal, I am using the kick sound, which is also pre-processed here. So this is way louder than the Odeholm, and this is my main kick sound. Next, One Kit Wonder Brutal, which I'm just using the snare from. Quite subtly, but it has some nice smack. Modern and Massive, I am using only the Snare Room channel. So you can see that I'm just using the room sound here for the snare. To my ear, this is the best sounding snare room, so I really love it. And finally, from P4, I am using the Pearl reference brass snare and the toms. A good idea to check here when you are blending different snare samples is to check that the tuning is the same. I've actually tuned it by a factor of 2 here so that it matches the tuning of the other snares. Okay, so let's start from the top, and I would like to start with what I have going on in the drum bus, because everything is being fed into one single drum bus. The first plugin I have going on is Spiff, which is adding a bit of extra attack, especially to the low end here. So it's adding a bit of extra smack to the kick drum. Next, I have some processing going on here using Virtual Mix Rack. I am not using a separate parallel compression chain. I used to do that before, but now I only have this distressor here at 36% mix, which is making the main compression sound. I also have this monster compressor here at the end at like 30%, so it's adding a lot of parallel compression, but only on the drum bus. Here my preset, it's based on a video I saw from Nolly, but yeah, experimented a bit on my own as well. And finally, just an EQ, cutting like the way high stuff here and adjusting the volume. A good rule of thumb is that the kick drum and the snare drum should have about equally loud hits here on the graph. To my experience, that sounds quite balanced and good. Alright, so let's start with the individual sounds, starting with this one, which I believe is the Odeholm kick. So this is the raw sound straight out of Odeholm drums. Firstly, I'm using auto align, and this I'm using both on the kick and the snare, which is automatically aligning the samples so they're completely in phase. But as you can see here, it's only altered like 4 samples, so it's hardly doing anything, I would say. Next, I'm just using an EQ for leveling, so it's like putting down 10 decibels from the Odeholm kick, because I don't want it as my main kick sound. I want something a bit more snappy, which I'm getting from One Hit Wonder Metal. Next, it's the One Hit Wonder Metal kick. Auto align, firstly, relay, just reducing 10 decibels here, just for leveling purposes. I have R-Bass from Waves, which is adding a bit of information at 54 Hertz. And finally, just an EQ, removing a little bit of the clickiness in this kick. I am now feeding both the Odeholm and the One Hit Wonder Metal kicks to a kick bus, which is then fed into the main drum bus that I showed you before. So together right now they sound like this. So you can hear exactly what the Odeholm kick is adding to the main kick sound. Just a little bit more beef. So firstly, I am compressing the 2 samples together. This is usually a good idea to make them sound more cohesive when they are compressed together. It's usually like gluing them together a bit. Next, we have Saturn just adding a bit of warm tube here, not too much. It's mainly adding a bit of fatness is what I'm hearing in the low end. Next we have multiband compression just on the bass here, which is mainly for blast beat sections. So I have the attack set moderately slow to allow some punch to come through. But as you can see, if I'm taking a blast beat section, I think over here, then you can see that it's continuously engaged. It's not coming back up, so that way I'm controlling it a little bit. I will say that I am also automating the kick here for the super fast parts. Just because it's getting a bit overbearing, especially the top end, like you want a really clicky kick to come through the mix, but also when it's blast beats that are as fast as this, it's getting too much and it's overshadowing the vocals, so I have to automate it down a little bit. Next, I just have a preset here from Slate Digital, the Bomber, which I really love for kick drums. It's adding a bit of punch to it. Very subtle, but I like what it's doing. Next we have this crazy looking EQ, which is, yeah, just the process of removing, adding stuff, getting some feedback from the band maybe, how clicky do you want the kick, etc, etc. But yeah, I will show you what this is doing. This is like mainly making this scooped sound. And then finally, I just heard a little bit too much click still around the 7K area, and then adding back a little bit at 10K. So yeah, this is the finished kick sound. Next, let's move on to the snares, and these I'm also feeding into a snare bus, the same as the kick bus, which is then being fed into the drum bus. So firstly, it's like the main snare sound, I would say, which is the high P5 snare. So as you can hear, as I said before, this is the pre-processed sound, so it's already sounding quite finished. Firstly, it's just relay to level it out a little bit. Next, I'm just removing a little bit of the low mids here in the snare. On its own, it's sounding a little bit hollow, but I am then adding back a lot of smack using the other samples. And finally, auto align, as I went through before, just to align the face of all of the snares. Next snare layer is the P4 snare, and this one is the raw sound of the P4 snare, so it's gonna have a bit more processing on it. Starting with these plugins, adding some compression and saturation. Next, we have some tape saturation. Not doing too much, actually. Spiff. I love this for adding some punch to the snare, so this is the beefy snare preset. Really punching it up a bit. Next, some EQ, and I'm also boosting it 5 decibels here. Next, the clipper using Flatline 2. Flattening it out a tiny bit. And finally, just auto align as before. Next, we're going to the One Hit Wonder Brutal snare. Another very smacky sample. Starting by reducing it 12 decibels and also removing a little bit of low end on it. Now you can hear it's really just this smacky, like almost hitting a cardboard with a drumstick sound, which is what I want from this sample. Some added compression and a transient designer here, adding a bit of sustain to the drum. Yeah, the compression is barely doing anything, actually. Finally, the Oda-Holm snare, I'm not doing anything apart from reducing it by 3.5 decibels. All of the snares together right now sound like this. Okay, now on the snare bus, I have this funny looking EQ, just leveling it out a bit and reducing some harshness here a bit. I heard a resonance here, I guess, and boosting the low end slightly. Soothe just to reduce some harshness. And finally, just a small EQ here, which is, removing a bit of harshness here around 7K. Together with the kick, it sounds like this. So as you can hear, the snare is pretty weak sounding compared to the kick drum, but that is because I am adding a bit of extra layers, which I'm going to show you now. So the first one, it's a ring layer, and I'm going to bring it up so you can hear it properly. So this is using a sample which is called Ring Job from Bogren Digital, and it sounds like this. So it's really this super ringy snare, and what is good about having it on a separate channel like this is that I can actually increase and decrease the ring, just like the Snare Room, to what fits the song. So like if it's a super fast section, I typically will lower the ring a bit, or if it's a like more calm section, I will also lower the snare ring. But if it's a heavy breakdown or a slower heavy section, I will bump this up. And you can also see here that I'm only triggering on the harder hits, so it's not triggering on the ghost notes. I'll bring it down for you so you can hear how bad it sounds if it's also triggering on the ghost notes. So yeah, not nice. So it's much better like this. Processing wise, I am removing all of the attack from the sample, and I am increasing the sustain because I really don't want any punch from this. I just want the like sustainy ringy sound. Next we have a compressor. And finally an EQ, which is just removing a ton of low end essentially, because I mainly want like the ringy stuff, which is here around 800, 1000 hertz or so. And then I'm finally just gonna bring it down to what I would typically do for mixing level. Next I have a reverb for the snare. I'm using Lustrous Plates from Slate Digital. I have a snare verb preset here, and I also have an EQ, which is just removing some top end and reducing some low end. So here is an added layer which I actually got requested from the band. This is a snare sample that they have used for another song of theirs before. It's essentially just a super pingy layer. I love this sample. So I am firstly reducing a lot of low end, but also adding up a lot of this pingy aspect you can hear. This stuff. So quite a lot of the snare sound is actually coming from this layer. Compressing it quite hard, and finally soothe just to reduce some harshness. And finally we have the damage snare, which I showed you before. These are using some different layers. Pretty crazy processing on this one, mainly reducing the side information because it has a lot of low end in the sides, which I'm not really interested in. I have some compression here. Not doing a whole lot, but a bit. Some tape saturation. And finally a limiter. Just really killing the attack of it. So apart from the Snare Room, this is the finished snare sound. Together with the kick. But let's get into the Snare Room, which is using the Modern and Massive Room as I showed you before. And yet again, it's the raw sound, so it has quite a lot of processing to get it sounding the way I want it to, but here is how it sounds. I am removing everything below 150 Hz, increasing some side information to give it a wider sound, and then I just have some small cuts here. Cleaning it up slightly. Saturn 2 warm tape, just absolutely hammering it 100% drive. Making it slightly distorted sounding. Next we have the Kramer Pi from Waves. Ever since I saw Null using this plugin on rooms, I have loved it. I've never used another compressor for snare rooms after that. After the compression, some added EQ, just removing a little bit here around 500 Hz. Removing a little bit of side here, but adding it at around 700 Hz or so. And finally, we have a second layer of compression, and I am removing all of the transients using a transient designer, so it's really just the sustain of the room. You can hear how that just kills the snare. I'm just gonna play the snare sound, and then I'm gonna add in the room. So it's so important for the overall sound, and as I told you, you can automate this up and down. So here for the super fast parts, I have lowered the room slightly. Like if we have this section with maxed out snare room, it's gonna sound really bad. But now it's like this. Hear how washy it gets instead of here. Very precise and attacky sound. So now we're through the kick and the snare, let's get into toms. So I'm actually feeding all of the toms into the same channel. I don't have separate channels for all of the toms. I used to do that before, but I've noticed that, yeah, I really don't need it when I have these pristine sounding recordings from GGD. So the first EQ is quite heavy-handed. It's removing a lot of mid information to get this smiley curve sound that you generally want for your toms. So you can hear it's quite muddy sounding, but this just cleans it up. So it's a great starting point. Next, some compression. Since I'm feeding all of the toms into one single channel, I can then process and compress them together. So if several toms are hitting at once, then it's compressing a bit more and thus leveling out toms in the overall drum mix. Next, just some tape saturation, it looks like. A limiter to remove some attack. Really important in these fast sounding songs to not have too much attack, I feel, on the toms. Here I have essentially like multi-band compression, just using dynamic EQ. Controlling the low end a bit. Completely unnecessary step, I would say, for you guys, but I'm using this new plugin from Oak Sound Bloom for essentially a similar effect. I am only controlling it a little bit more in the mid and side channels, so essentially reducing the sides but boosting the mids of the way lows here to not get too muddy sound in the sides channels. So yeah, not doing too much. And finally, just removing some harshness here in the top end. I am feeding the toms into the snare reverb just a little bit lower than the actual snare itself. Okay, let's get into the cymbals. And raw, this is the sound of the P5 cymbals. So yeah, quite harsh sounding, especially when it's going through the drum bus processing. So this first EQ is essentially just cutting a bunch of this high harsh information, and here an additional cut in the mid channel around 2K. Some compression here to start. I have a preset here for smooth overheads. It's mixed in at 40%. Soothe, just using the preset here from Nolly. Really smoothing out the tone. Pro MB, just keeping everything in check here. Super consistent sound using that plugin. Next, in the plugin Fiesta for this track, it's Bloom. And adding to a similar vein of plugin, Golfos, to also smoothen out the cymbals. I will say I'm using a lot of expensive plugins for really no use here. Like, you could achieve a similar thing using a one EQ. This is just a process of iteration over a long period of time. So that's why sometimes you can see these long plugin chains which are not adding too much. It is brightening the cymbals a bit here though. Ozone 11, also just using the clarity and stabilizer. So yeah, it's like Golfos, Ozone and Bloom, they are doing very similar things. I could probably just push one of these plugins harder to get the same results. Okay, and here it's an EQ mainly removing some information in the mid channels. I would assume this move is after listening in the full mix. Maybe I wanted a bit more space for like the vocals, like the sibilance of the vocals, which is why I would remove this kind of stuff in the cymbals. Another EQ, also probably an iterative add-on from like feedback from the band or something. And the final EQ, just again, some harshness at 7K. So yeah, a little bit less elegant of a plugin chain from what I had on my other instances, but yeah, it's getting the job done. And yeah, that's it. Together, the drum sound is now finished. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial on my ultimate deathcore drum sound. I really hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the video, what was your main takeaway. If you're not yet subscribed, we are soon at 10K subscribers, so please press that button, press the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.